Professor Green, if you would like to start.
Sure, Sarah. Thank you, and thank you all for being here with us tonight. We're delighted to have Tara Setmayer with us as our first speaker this year at the Penn Political Union. For those of you unfamiliar with the union, it's one of the main initiatives sponsored by the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy, which I direct. And now we're in our 4th year of this partnership where students who are arrayed in different political parties come together to debate and discuss issues of the day, but in conversation with prominent outside speakers from civil society, journalists, academics, activists, and so forth. And we take pride in the multi-partisan aspect of this venue. In a single month last year, we had debates with Governor Jeb Bush and DSA Representative Dustin Guastella. And it wasn't just that different people came together at the venue at different times to discuss urgent political issues, but the same people came to discuss and listen and argue with people at very different ends of the political spectrum. We know we're living in times when we feel that there's tremendous amounts of disagreement and almost unraveling of political systems, both here and in other parts of the world. And a venue like the Penn Political Union, I think, models how we can come together in an informative, constructive way and learn from each other. But it also models how we can continue to disagree with each other, how we can engage, make arguments, but do so in a way that is respectful and constructive. And so I'm very proud to be part of this group. I'm very proud for the Mitchell Center to be associated with it. And we're deeply honored to have Tara Setmayer be our inaugural speaker for the 2021 year at the Political Union. And we look forward, in spite of all the challenges, to making this one of the best years ever at the Penn Political Union. And so now I'll turn things over to the person who's been so instrumental to the success of the union in recent years, its speaker, Sarah Root.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Green. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Root, and I am the speaker of the Penn Political Union. And I'd like to welcome everyone to our first event of the semester and our first virtual event ever. So we live in exciting times. So the Penn Political Union is Penn's premier multi-partisan debate and discussion organization. And I invite you, if you have not yet filled out the form, or interest form, to fill out the interest form. It is posted in the chat. So please fill that out if you are new to the union and if you're a returning member to the union, just so that we can get in contact with you. And if you fill out the interest form, you get to hear about more of our amazing upcoming events. And I'd also like to welcome our esteemed guest, Ms. Tara Setmayer. Setmayer is a current political commentator on CNN and ABC News and a former GOP Communications Director on Capitol Hill, where she handled policy issues including immigration and federal law enforcement. In addition to this, Setmayer is also a 2020 Harvard Institute of Politics resident fellow. An outspoken conservative critic of President Trump, Setmayer works as a senior advisor for the Lincoln Project. I'm very excited for today's event, and I want to give everyone a brief overview of how it will be run. So for the first 45 minutes to an hour or so, our 5 caucus chairs will direct the conversation with Ms. Setmayer, and this will be then followed by a period for the audience to ask questions, which I'll explain more when the time comes. I will be moderating the discussion, which revolves around the major theme of media sensationalism, but I also hope that we can touch on some of the other recent mainstream political events that the media has been covering. And with that, I'd like to introduce our caucus chairs. Starting with our progressive caucus chair, we have Michael. Michael, can you say hi?
Hey, everyone.
Then we have our liberal caucus chair, Haven.
Hey, everyone.
We have our centrist caucus chair, Javier.
How's it going?
We have our libertarian caucus chair, Adam.
Good evening, everyone.
And we have our fill-in conservative caucus chair, Andrew, who is joining us for the evening. Andrew?
Sorry, it didn't let me unmute myself for some reason.
Oh,
But
we'll
happy to be
fix
here.
that. Yeah, we will fix that. All right, awesome. So with that, I would like to start the conversation off by turning to our Liberal caucus. Haven, can you ask your first question?
Yeah, so obviously, thanks to everyone all around for hosting this, and I love being part of PPU. So my question is, what role do you think that media sensationalism played in the rise of Donald Trump?
Thank you for that question, Haven, and thank you to everyone and to the Penn Political Union for having me. This is it is quite the time to be alive, to steal a line from Hamilton. And I'm thrilled to see so many people that are involved, engaged, that may not have been activated before, doing everything they can to continue to preserve our democracy. So thank you guys so much for having me. And I hope that everyone enjoys the event. And I'm looking forward to everybody's questions. So the first question, what role do I think the media played in it? A considerable amount. I think that there was a lot of media malfeasance and malpractice throughout the 2015 and 2016 campaign. Les Moonves, the former head of CBS, said that Donald Trump was great for television, terrible for the country. That was during the election. So he recognized that Donald Trump was a boon for the media industry. I mean, every cable news network made record profits. It was people's eyeballs were glued to the television because Donald Trump's candidacy became such a spectacle. What was he going to say next? What outrageous thing was he going to do? And that's kind of the way the media covered him. He did not get the same type of scrutiny that anyone else, any other serious political candidate would have received, given his background, given the questionable business dealings. I mean, there was some effort to uncover those things, but it became about the spectacle every single day. And the free media coverage that Donald Trump received by covering his rallies, you know, from beginning to end, live on 3 networks, 3 cable news networks, it was billions in free media. So, you know, excuse me, that contributed to being inundated with Trump in our living rooms constantly. And people who watch The Apprentice, which is really where it all started, as far as beaming Trump into your living room, people felt like they knew him and felt a connection, and he had this persona that was built up, as the Apprentice, you know, namesake basically. And he was able to convince people that that was who he was. And once that narrative was already set, I mean, he had 100% name ID. People were pretty set on, oh, well, we want some change, and that's what we do, and that's how the media covered it. So I think that there was a considerable amount of media malpractice, and I'm really hoping that lessons were learned. I think some of them have been, but I worry that the level of scrutiny is still not where it should be, and the focus is still not where it should be on certain things concerning this administration, because now there's a record.
Awesome. Do any of the chairs have follow-up questions relating to that? Haven, do you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, I actually wanted to remark on like the turn a bit in conservative media a little bit. And specifically, I'm thinking of like National Review. They ran that fairly large piece in the 2016 election saying like never Trump for XYZ reason. And now I think they've taken on the mantle of like the anti-Trump. And could you explain, could you explain like the switch that happened there?
Yes, it's one word: money. It was for survival. Which is very disheartening, because I grew up reading the National Review. It was the preeminent conservative publication for conservatives. When I was your age, I was the vice chair of the College Republicans at GW. I was fully enthralled and enveloped in political everything in Washington, D.C. And I constantly read the National Review. Bill Buckley was a conservative hero of mine. And, you know, to see the paper, to see the magazine go from the conservative intellectual voices of people like Bill Buckley and Jonah Goldberg and Charles Krauthammer and others over the years to what it became after Donald Trump, it was apparent that Trump was going to win. it was disconcerting because it felt as though they were just being intellectually dishonest in order to survive. If you notice that the Weekly Standard, which was run by Bill Kristol, did not survive because they were not sufficiently pro-Trump enough. And I'm sure that there were others who looked at that and they made a calculated business decision. Same thing with Glenn Beck. If you notice that, I worked for The Blaze. It was my first media job after Capitol Hill. And I was shocked at the hypocrisy that I saw. Glenn was a Never Trump guy. He was in that, I think he might've been on the cover of that National Review edition, but he was definitely one of them that wrote, his own version of why Trump shouldn't be elected. And we see that he has taken a complete 180 on that, again, for financial survival. Red State was another one. Eric Erickson, who was another strong conservative voice, right-wing media voice. He lost almost everything and lost control of Red State when he decided to go Never Trump. He was one of the originals, as a matter of fact. He disinvited Trump from the Red State conference that they have during the election years. And he caught a lot of heat for that and saw that it wasn't a sustainable position for him as a business model, and he ended up reversing course. So the bottom line is that, unfortunately, a lot of the center-right and right-wing media made a calculated decision that in order to survive, they had to compromise some things that they never would have before if Donald Trump had been a traditional Republican or a Democrat. So unfortunately, I feel as though it was really just about financial survival over principle.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So we're having a slight problem with some people who are Zoom bombing our chat. So I'm going to ask all co-hosts to not approve any more of our participants. With that, I would like
That's
Andrew.
a first.
Yeah,
That's a first. I have to admit, it's the world that we live in now. I've had all kinds of weird social media things since the era of Donald Trump, but I've never had a Zoom bomb.
yeah. Well,
It's
they're
a first for all of us.
Truly. So Andrew, would you please ask your first question?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thank you so much, Tara, for being here. My question is, I think a lot of conservatives really sympathize with the Lincoln Project's criticisms of Donald Trump, but many found it problematic to target the Senate majority. So I guess my question is, why do you think it is important for the Lincoln Project to target Senate Republicans such as Susan Collins? And what implications does that have for the Supreme Court and other conservative priorities?
So that has been something that, as part of the Lincoln Project, many of us have had to explain, right? Because they're like, okay, we get that you guys think that Trump is terrible, and we're glad that you're, going after that side of it, being more aggressive. But what are you doing going after the Senate majority? You want the Democrats to have control of everything. You're apostates for that. And this is our simple answer to that. Donald Trump would not be able to do what he's been able to do by blowing up democratic norms, institutions, and ideals, getting away with his criminality, getting away with the things that he did that warranted the impeachment, Bill Maher politicizing the Justice Department, all of those things he would not have been able to get away with, which he's currently getting away with, if the people in the Senate had done their job instead of abdicated it during the impeachment trial, stopped certain nominations. For example, Ratcliffe never should have been approved as the DNI. He was rejected in the beginning. That's why he was withdrawn. And he's a political crony, completely unqualified to be the director of national intelligence, but the Senate went along with it. Lindsey Graham has made an absolute mockery of the Judiciary Committee. He should be ashamed of himself. All of these people have been enablers. Marco Rubio on the Intelligence Committee, at least they were able to come out with a bipartisan report that was pretty damning and showed a lot of colluding stuff with the Trump campaign in Russia. But they have not done the proper oversight. And we feel at the Lincoln Project that the only way for things to change is to burn it all to the ground and start again, because they have just so egregiously mishandled their jobs as oversight and as guardrails for what Donald Trump is doing. From Susan Collins to Cory Gardner to McSally, and others, they have to pay a political price. I mean, everybody knows that in Politics 101, that all elected officials are single seekers of re-election, and they will not change as long as they continue to be rewarded with power. And we at the Lincoln Project feel as though restoring our democratic norms and institutions and protecting this country and the republic from the dangers that Donald Trump poses and the dangers that people like Bill Maher pose to our constitutional norms is worth losing the Senate over. And we can start again. Maybe then a lesson will be sent and learned that you can't behave that way and expect to keep your office in the Senate. So that's it. We're willing to take the risk. As far as Supreme Court justices, yeah, I mean, that's that's the risk that we run with it. But we just feel like if in a Biden, a Biden presidency, you have to still have a supermajority to get a Supreme Court justice through for the most part. So we want to get rid of the filibuster. That would be a disaster. But there are still certain things that I think you're not going to get that are so costly to us as a country. If we don't get the perfect conservative Supreme Court justice, it's not the end of the world. I know a lot of people feel differently about that, but you never quite know. There shouldn't be a litmus test, and you never quite know. As long as they're qualified jurists, then we need to get past this purity test with the Supreme Court justices. You look at what the Chief Justice did during the Obamacare debate. You just never quite know where they're going to end up. So I just don't think that should be the single sole issue that people base their vote on this time around, because Donald Trump, in our opinion, is that much of a threat to everything if he continues and gets reelected. And if the people in the Senate continue, who have enabled him, continue to allow people like Bill Maher and others and completely manipulate our justice system and potentially punish political enemies like that, we're dangerously veering away from a liberal democracy to an illiberal one under this current regime. So that's why it's worth it for us to get rid of those people who are enablers.
Awesome. Do any of the caucus chairs have follow-up questions to that? Haven, go ahead.
I just don't want to take up too much airtime.
No, go ahead.
Jesus. I just on the subject of kind of conservative apostasy, you mentioned John Roberts, and I remember in 2012 when he did the Obamacare decision, he was skewered. In conservative media. And today he's because of that vote, not regarded as a real conservative. And I just wonder, do you think that they're now in the modern Trump Republican Party, it's much more ever present, but do you think there was always that strain there of kind of weeding out any form of dissent in the party leading up to him?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I've been involved in Republican politics for 25 years. I know I don't look old enough, but yes, I'm old. And I've watched this kind of trend. It became more apparent to me during the rise of the Tea Party. But, on further reflection and reading some of my fellow conservative thought leaders who have kind of begun to study this, it actually started way before the Tea Party with some of the tactics that they were using. Julian Zelizer wrote a really good book about Newt Gingrich and the rise of Newt Gingrich and his reign as speaker, and then how he got there in some of the tactics he used in the 80s that I was unaware of. I was too young, but I had no idea about. And look at what he did and the way that he used media and the way that he used intimidation tactics to get what he wanted, and how that's reflected today tenfold. He kind of created a monster with him. He laid the predicate for it. So I think that for sure, Tim Alberta wrote a fantastic book. His book, American Carnage, is a really good TikTok of kind of how we got here. And, I can even look back and see some of the Facebook posts that from 10 years ago, like during the Tea Party era, where some of the language I used, I'm like, oh, it makes my stomach turn now because I see what it's turned into today. And I'm like, how much of that was I a part of? I've had to do some serious self-reflection on the role that I played that contributed to some of this that we're living through now. So yeah, absolutely. I think that this was the pushing it more and more toward, these purity tests, and you're either 100% with us or you're against us or you're a rhino, right? That was the big thing too. John McCain and Lindsey Graham and the more moderates, they were rhinos, and and it's just
Lindsey Graham, a rhino.
worse. I know. Lindsey, he's so confused about many things. That's again, it's another example of where they were starting to kind of fracture each other out in the Republican Party. So absolutely, it started before the Trump era.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to.
Yeah.
Other caucus chairs, any thoughts? Yeah, Andrew.
So recently there has been, on the news, there was a Tennessee Democrat who was basically taken off the Democratic ballot, even though he's the incumbent, because he voiced pro-life opinions. And there have also been a lot of other efforts to primary Democrats within the Democratic Party for kind of straying from that orthodoxy. So I guess my question is, given that it seems that we have more ideological tests being put up on both sides of the aisle, where does the country move forward from this? How can we make dissent more acceptable again?
That is the idea. The country was founded on dissent, and it's so disheartening to me when I see dissent being squashed, because but it's okay to debate those things. It's okay to have different opinions. It's okay to disagree on policy and things, but the politics of personal destruction, to steal a 90s phrase from the Democrats, it's really gotten out of control. And something that's a moral issue. I'm personally pro-life, and but I also look at it from a pragmatic perspective, that it's settled law at this point. And there's only, so much, it's more of a local issue, state and local issue at this point, what's allowed and what isn't, for people to be, because they, depending, unless you're like, threatening violence or something against abortion providers or anything like that, where it goes left, we don't advocate any of that. But for people like in the Women's March, for example, conservative women who were pro-life were not welcomed in the Women's March after Trump got elected. It shouldn't be, that is, if, as women, if you're, fighting for the same equality and the same, we're not talking about reproductive rights, because it was bigger than that. And it wasn't an abortion rally. It was supposed to be about empowering women. You should be accepting of the fact that there are women who believe that life begins at conception, and that they don't believe that abortion is a moral issue. But that shouldn't separate you from having the same common ground about respect for women, or whatever the Women's March was supposed to be representing, and empowering women. And so it is on both sides where they do these purity tests, and people pay a price for it. Republicans complain about cancel culture, but they do the same thing. Trump does cancel culture all the time with stuff, and these Republicans, it's the same thing. If you're not part of that orthodoxy, that's it. You don't see it my way, that's it. And that is just not a way to run a healthy democracy, when it was born on dissent, and our founding fathers created the system that we have so that a minority dissenting voice would have its say. And so this level of incivility on both sides when it comes to differing points of view is a very dangerous path, and I hope that we can change that.
Yeah, I do definitely see this sort of purity test on both sides of the aisle, and it's definitely prevalent on college campuses, where you can be like not conservative enough for the conservatives and not liberal enough for the liberals and whatnot. So with that, I'm actually going to move on to our centrist caucus chair, Javier. Can you, are you able to unmute yourself, Javier?
Okay, thank you. Hi, Tara. My name is Javier. Thank you for agreeing to be here. So
Sure,
my
thank you.
first question is, what, if any, restrictions should there be on media/press that deliberately spread false information to the American people?
So it's so difficult, given that we have a First Amendment right to freedom of the press. It's very difficult to do this because do we want to do what the UK has done, where they have hate speech and laws and certain things, and you have to certain things you can't say in the press, and do we want that? How do we, where's the responsibility of these media organizations to make sure that they don't spread disinformation? When you have, they're private, so it's difficult. You don't have state-run media. Some would disagree with that and say that Fox News and OANN are kind of the closest thing to that. But it's still a private company. They're still private companies. And that's where the rise of social media, like this is kind of funny because this discussion started years ago when we first had the internet and blogs coming up, right? Citizen journalists and it was kind of like the traditional journalists were horrified by this because the tenets, I was a journalism minor at GW, and my professor, Professor Puffenbarger, was a long time Washington Post editor and reporter, and he was a very popular journalism professor, and he would be spinning in his grave right now knowing how many of the old tenets of journalism have been just thrown out the window because of social media. Everybody can be their own journalist now. Our enemies have exploited this. There's no, it's no accident that this is the route that Russia has chosen to use to spread disinformation and to influence the American electorate. It's not an accident. There's a lot of power in information, or lack thereof, or the manipulation of that. I just don't, I get worried that the civil libertarian part of myself gets worried when we start talking about the government regulating media in any way. I don't like that, because who determines what's, what should be told or not? It's very Orwellian. It wigs me out. I don't like that. But then on the flip side of it is we have these, we just look at what the Trump administration itself has done, what Trump uses his Twitter account to do, and his acolytes do the same. What responsibility do the social media platforms have? And I think they're trying to address that as private companies. Twitter now putting flagging disinformation, like what Trump is doing with voting, voting rights and the misinformation there. Manipulated videos, they're either pulling them down or flagging them. Same thing with Facebook. That's a start. And I just think that there needs to be more responsibility with that. And that's where having trust in our intelligence community and having trust in the folks who are experts in these areas, and when they tell you, look, this is what Russia's doing, or this is what China's doing, this is what it looks like. Do not forward this. Do not perpetuate this. And when you need to have trust in those institutions so people are informed. Thomas Jefferson was very adamant about protecting newspapers and making sure that they had the freedom to report information, so we had an informed citizenry, and because he said without that, then the citizenry is susceptible like sheep and wolves, sheep to wolves. The government could be, without having the government being checked and balanced by an informed citizenry, and it was the press's job to do that. So, how far we've come in some respects is alarming to me. But I just don't want the government. I think it's a slippery slope if we start asking the government to do that. And I don't even know if it would be legal, to be honest. That would be an interesting Supreme Court case to see how they would rule on that. But I think it's pretty clear that our Constitution wants no parts of the government regulating our free press.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And my second question, how has media sensationalism evolved or applied to race and police shootings? I've been noticing this since, I think, 2012. But it's more apparent now to me that I feel like race is being mentioned a lot more on media, especially when it comes to policing and stuff like that.
So I don't think that you're alone in that observation. Some will say that's because everyone has their own video cameras now to shoot things all the time and record them. So everyone's a citizen journalist with their phones in their hands. So more things are captured on video, and so they spread faster because of social media. But as someone who comes from a law enforcement family, my grandfather was captain of my hometown police department. He was a police officer for 40 years. My husband is a federal law enforcement officer and has been for 20 years and counting. I have a very different perspective when it comes to what happens with police brutality and the videos and some of the protests and things, because I don't immediately jump to conclusions. When you're around law enforcement your whole life, you start to understand a bit more about the mentality of law enforcement officers and the situations they're in. I've personally been through a citizens police academy, which I think are things that should be prevalent in every major locality, so that average citizens can understand a bit more what police officers think, what their decision-making process is, the types of scenarios that they face all the time. I think if there was just better community policing and understanding, that people wouldn't jump to as many conclusions so quickly with certain things. Notwithstanding that there is a problem, clearly, with systemic racism in some departments, and this has been going on for decades, and we can no longer ignore what we see when we see it. The issue I have, though, is it is true that it's rather rare for unarmed men of color to be killed by police unjustifiably. Comparatively speaking to the amount of interactions that police officers have with citizens every year, it's in the millions. It's like 1 million and something interactions. And so then you have a handful of these more sensationalized cases that the public gets national attention, and then everybody freaks out because they think this is every department, and the police are inherently corrupt, and where there's a problem, there needs to be better supervision, better vetting, better training, and better response when you have these situations. Like what happened in Rochester, New York, is egregious. The cover-ups and all of this, and that we can't have that. When you have questions about gangs in the LA Police Department, you need to address it. And as someone who bleeds blue, I believe that blue lives matter. And I don't say that as a person who's like trying to be some kind of white supremacist, because it's been co-opted now. But as the wife of a law enforcement officer, we need to make sure that our police officers, all the good ones, which are the most of them, that they are held to a higher standard and that they are not demonized because of the acts of the bad ones. Because nobody hates a bad police officer more than a good police officer, and that's true. So there's a responsibility within the policing community to police themselves as well, to try to address these problems, because they haven't been doing that. The thin blue line is a real thing. But what the media has done is that when they blow up some of these more local cases, I don't think that they bring enough balance or context sometimes in the beginning, because they just automatically, like the Michael Brown situation in Ferguson is a perfect example. People were quick. He got shot. He was walking home down the street. He got shot in the back by a rogue police officer that, woke up and decided he wanted to shoot a black kid that day. That was absolutely the complete opposite of what happened. And that narrative went so far left. You had riots, you had, looting, all this, you had national protests. The stand up, don't shoot thing was actually a fantasy. That did not happen. But that it was too late. That officer's life is ruined. He had to leave his house. Unfortunately, Michael Brown lost his life. Anytime a life was lost, it's unfortunate. But it wasn't the media ran with a narrative that wasn't true. And nobody pays attention to the correction. So I think there has to be more balance and responsibility to that, because it emboldens people to start saying, F the police. Next thing you know, you've got what happened in LA over the weekend with somebody, shooting 2 police officers at point blank range, or executing police officers like they did in 2016 in Dallas, or New York, where you have retaliations. It's a slippery slope. So there just needs to be, I think, better, more responsible reporting on some of these things to put things in context. And there are some that try to do that, but everyone knows if it bleeds, it leads. Unfortunately, that's still true. As primitive as that may sound, but that's what sensationalism gets eyeballs and readers.
Before I ask another question, I don't know if the other chairs want to follow up before I change the topic.
So actually, I have a quick thing, and then I think we're going to move on to Adam's questions. But I have just a quick question to like probe deeper on that. I think there's sort of this cycle of the media focusing intently on these protests and then like not covering them at all, even though the protests are still ongoing, right? So you could see that in like Portland, Oregon, for like a solid month after they covered them at the beginning, and then for a solid month they didn't cover them until Trump sent federal troops into Portland, and things went crazy. Do you think it's an intentional response of the media to overcompensate for their previous coverage and like the effects of that previous coverage, and possibly the effects of sensationalism, or do you think it's sort of an unintentional consequence of the media cycle, the news cycle being so 24-hour constant and like, just moving on to things really quickly?
Yeah, there's always pressure, especially for, nightly news. You only have like 23 minutes after commercials. Every 30 seconds counts of what you cover on network nightly news. Cable news obviously has 24 hours to fill, so it's they have a bit more latitude, so they've got to fill that time. But the chaos of this administration takes up so much of the oxygen, the news oxygen, that I think that sometimes they just can't keep up. It's literally like a fire hose of controversy constantly that they have to make these editorial decisions. There may have been a point where they felt like what was happening in Portland was a local issue. It was literally like 2 blocks. It was destruction and out of control. And I don't know what the hell the Portland mayor and everyone was doing, allowing that. It was ridiculous. But it didn't become a national story until the president injected himself nationally and decided that law and order, he decided to resurrect Nixon from '68 and create this law and order campaign message, and uses those visuals to back up his claim, to make everybody to believe that you could be the next Portland. So yeah, I just think that there's certain decisions have to be made about how much time to give to what's a local story, what's a national story. And once Trump did that, it became a national story. And then, we started to hear all the shenanigans that were going on as well, which were, seemed to be civil rights violations. And if we had a Senate that was honest, we would know, we'd get to the bottom of it, but we don't, which is why the Lincoln Project is trying to get rid of them. But yeah, sometimes does the media do things to overcompensate? Possibly, it's still a business. It's still a business.
Definitely. Thank you. Okay, with that, Adam, would you like to ask your questions?
Sure. I'd like to also thank you so much for coming, and Penn Political Union. I've always been involved with it past 2 years, and I very much recommend anyone even slightly interested to fill out the form and just follow up with the events, which are now easier than ever to attend. So question I had is sort of looking towards the future, back towards about the Republican Party. As you said, the right-wing media is generally sort of, in many cases, cave to Trump, even when it won't, go completely his way. A lot of the senators in Congress seem to be on his side. So I guess the question is sort of, remember the Lincoln Project. So let's say like Biden wins, for example, as you're hoping for. What could a post-Trump Republican Party look like, given that it's the Republican Party and Trump has become increasingly indistinguishable in past years? So I guess where do we go from here, assuming sort of all goes well in November?
Yeah, that is a $1 million question. There are a lot of us that are now, as much as we're focused on November 3rd, there are a lot of us who are also focused on what the hell happens after that. Now what? And I just think, and the reason why we're all so supportive of a Biden presidency is because we know that he's a good and decent person. We may disagree vehemently on multiple policy issues, but the things that are most important that we feel right now, the priority right now, is not any specific policy. It is literally protecting the future of our constitutional republic. And we know that Joe Biden will uphold the Constitution. He will respect democratic norms and institutions and ideals. And he will not be an imperial, an imperial president. There won't be a corrupt Justice Department. Those types of institutions, building back the institutional integrity of our government is something that's a priority. So we can fight over policy later, but what do we do with all the Trump supporters? They're not going away on November 4th if he loses. What are they going to do? And I just think that we have to have a coalition of the decent come together and remind the American people what this country was founded on, what unifies us, not this populist, nationalist tribalism. That has to be burned to the ground. And the only way to do that is for more people and, to come together in a bipartisan way and show that you can govern in a bipartisan way, and still argue over policy differences. But the common, we're not gonna have to argue over what, whether it's constitutionally acceptable to do X, Y, and Z. We're not going to have to worry about a president that's going to use the Joint Chiefs of Staff as a political prop to clear peaceful protesters. Like those are things that are just so fundamentally against what our basic principles are. So what does a post-Republican Party look like after Trump? I think it's going to be a disaster at first. It's going to be a smoldering mess. But it's going to take people that like us and like those of us in the Lincoln Project and Republican Voters Against Trump. And there's a new group coming out called Repair that's being started by former Republican elected officials and cabinet members and things like that. Stand Up Republic. I sit on the board of Stand Up Republic, which was started by Evan McMullin after he ran for president in 2016, and that's who I voted for actually. They are very focused on restoring institutional norms. So there are thought leaders out there that are going to have to come together and figure out a way forward. Otherwise, the Republican Party is going to go the way of the Whigs, and we'll start a new one. It wouldn't be the first time in American history. Wouldn't want to see that though. You want two healthy parties at least. Some would argue that its parties are becoming antiquated. I mean, the founding fathers never wanted factions, right? That's what they called them. They worried about what would happening, and it has. Worse than they probably ever imagined. There's a reason why the press is mentioned in the Constitution, but political parties are not. So, maybe it's a time to reevaluate the two-party system. I'm not sure, but there's going to be a lot of discussions about how we move forward. I wish I had an easy answer for it. It's going to be tough no matter what happens.
Yes, certainly. For asking another question, is there any other caucus chairs have any follow-ups?
I mean, I actually just want to play like because I kind of want to I want to play like the devil's ad, like the Trumpian Republican response to that, like what do you say to someone who's like, well, he might be bad, but we have the judges, we have the tax cuts, we have the at least we have someone who's pro-life in there. He's kind of the bulwark against the left. And Joe Biden is just a holdover to a more liberal agenda. Like, why would we might not like everything about him, but an election is the lesser of two evils, and to us, he's the lesser of two evils.
Well, to people like that, there's really not much you're going to say to convince them. I mean, he literally has. If you're making those excuses for everything that this guy has done, for a few policy wins, then you're not going to be convinced. And then I would also say that you're not a conservative, because a conservative does not stand for what Donald Trump has done in order to get a couple policy wins. It's bigger than just those party W's. And so they clearly have no problem with the United States creeping toward authoritarianism. They have no problem with a corrupt president. They have no problem, apparently, with a Republican president who cozies up to dictators. Complete anathema to what our national security priorities used to be as Republicans: the importance of our strategic alliances overseas, the importance of human rights and Western style democracies. Apparently, none of that matters as long as you get what you want. That is a really, really selfish and civically irresponsible way to view things. And I would say that you don't need someone like Donald Trump, who destroys our institutions and makes a mockery of the Constitution and law and order, in order to get those policy wins. You could have any normal Republican would have been able to get what Donald Trump did passed, and then some, without all of the other stuff. So you're okay with the bigotry, you're okay with the racism, you're okay with the dishonesty, you're okay with the batshit crazy things about conspiracies and, telling people to try bleach as a disinfectant for COVID. You're okay with the incompetence. You're okay with a president that was willing to let 200,000 plus Americans die in order to, get an election victory in his mind. I mean, they're rationalizing away things that they never would have accepted if it had not been a Republican president. And that mindset is, I don't even think they would have accepted it if it was actually a regular Republican. I don't think so. There's a certain scary amount of people in this country who are willing to follow someone that has authoritarian leanings like Donald Trump, because they themselves are, feel as though they need validation. So they, follow a leader here who gives them a voice at the expense of our constitutional norms. That is really, really dangerous. And if you want to continue to make excuses, and that's the world you want to bring your kids up in, that responsibility is on you. I'm hoping there's more of us than them.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And I never thought that I would say that there are just some people who are just, irredeemable, like the whole deplorable thing. You never want to talk about your fellow citizens like that. Or, that was always something that was taboo. But,
I'm the liberal. I'm okay saying they're irredeemable.
I hear you, but but you look at some of the behavior of these folks over the last couple of years, and I'm sorry, it's deplorable. And there is a cult of personality, a death cult, in my opinion, at this point, that is following Donald Trump over the cliff here, that I just never thought would be possible in this country. And this amount, with the amount of people, it's mind-boggling. There will be volumes and volumes of books written about this time period. I guarantee it.
Yeah. Let me specify, only some are irredeemable.
Yes, they're not all, but unfortunately more than I would like to admit to, which just makes me sad.
Thank you. All right, Michael, I know you've been waiting anxiously for the chance to ask your questions, so I will turn it over to you.
All right, thanks for joining today, Tara. Seeing as Adam slightly poached my question, I'll ask another one. A lot of the main team members which comprise the Lincoln Project were either part of the Bush administration or people who wrote very, very favorably of him. An administration under which agencies like DHS and ICE and things like, the Patriot Act were heavily ramped up or even created. How do you kind of reconcile your current message of being against this creeping authoritarianism with the seeming continuity that you can find from the Bush era to today?
So I think that, anytime that you have large legislation or a large change in a structural change in the government, right? DHS was a leviathan created in response to 9/11, something that was unprecedented. They thought that would be the way to do it. Let's consolidate all of our federal law enforcement and the Coast Guard, which never made sense to me, and put them all under one umbrella. And that way we won't have the wall of separation like we had in the 90s that led to some of the cues that were missed on 9/11, leading up to 9/11. And that would be the answer to that. Sometimes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and sometimes you make mistakes. And as you see the way that those policies or structural changes have played out, you have to make adjustments. You have to look back in hindsight and say, well, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. The crime bill is a perfect example. In the 90s, Joe Biden has had to go back and reflect on some of the things that he supported in that crime bill that were well-intentioned. He caught a lot of heat for it, so Hillary did too, which was interesting because she had nothing to do with it getting passed. She was first lady at the time. But in 2016, it was an issue, you know, mass incarceration and her comments about super predators and all this. And now, you know, Joe Biden has had to kind of face the music on the mass incarceration result of the crime bill. And at the time, you had the Congressional Black Caucus overwhelmingly supported it. Black mayors and city council members were supportive of what was in the crime bill at the time because the crime was out of control in a lot of major cities. You're coming out of the crack epidemic, you had a lot going on. So they thought it was a good thing. Unfortunately, the byproduct ended up being mass incarceration that disproportionately hurt Black and brown folks. So you have to, same thing with us. There are parts of the Patriot Act that, 20 years after 9/11, that's why they are sunset. They have to be renewed every couple of years. Section 214, I think, is one of them. And they have to be renewed by Congress, which is the way it should be. You have a deliberative process. Congress takes a look at it. We elect those folks to represent our views. And if that's what they decide, as long as it's legal, okay. If you don't like it, then vote people out that aren't going to support that. Some of the other mistakes that were made, DHS, my husband works for an agency that was not under, probably should not have been under DHS and thrived when they were under a different cabinet agency. It's been one of the other things. It's a lot of those, too much bureaucracy. You become, people get lost in the shuffle, and there's a lot of political jockeying for funds and attention. And it wasn't, the DHS is entirely too big. Some of those agencies should go back to where they were, or they should pare it down or break it up. So, the things that crept over from the Bush administration, we still had 8 years of Obama. They could have reversed them. They chose not to. Some they did, some they didn't. But it's just that's the way that we govern. When you have a representative government, if there's laws or things that are that you don't like or that should be sunset and reauthorized, that's the process you go through, and it gives you a chance for redemption. You learn from your mistakes. That's what makes a good public policy maker. You're not going to be right all the time.
Awesome. All right. So I think we have time for one more caucus chair to ask a question. Any of the caucus chairs? Adam, I know you had a question.
Yes, I had another sort of, I guess, follow-up question to what I asked. And so, there's definitely a rough road for the Republicans ahead, so no matter what happens. However,
yes.
So if, I guess, in the other circumstance, if Trump is reelected, which doesn't seem likely at the moment, but did not in 2016.
Could happen. Yeah.
I guess sort of what are Lincoln Project's plans going forward? What do you think the game plan would be in that case? And would that sort of be the end, or would that just be, you got to fight a little harder and sort of try to get past this?
Well, God help us if Donald Trump wins a second term. I don't even like to speak it. It gives me agita. I'm part Italian. It gives me agita to even think of that. However, the race is still close enough where it could go either way. And I wish that the Biden campaign would be a bit more aggressive in their approach to this, but that's a different question. What happens? If Donald Trump wins again, we really need to, the Lincoln Project would step up their efforts. We're not going away, come November 4th or January 20th, depending on what happens. We're not going away. Neither are any of the other groups who are dedicated to trying to protect our republic, because we're really going to need it then. And then you start to turn your focus to the midterms. And again, back to the enablers question. Why would we go after certain senators and things? You have to find people. Like if Trump is elected and you have a Democratic House and Senate, that is going to be, that'll be interesting. Nothing will get done. Nothing will get done. It'll be worse gridlock. We'll be continually fighting to try to stop him from ruling as an autocrat, because that's the road that we're going down. He's already bypassing Congress worse than anything President Obama ever did. You know, I remember when Republicans were, you know, apoplectic about how, you know, Obama had a pen and a phone and he was circumventing Congress on things. And please, that is child's play compared to what Donald Trump has done as far as an overreaching executive. It's out of control. So yeah, if Donald Trump wins again, God help us. I just best believe that the fight will continue. But we're exhausted. We're exhausted.
Awesome. All right, so I think we're going to transition into the audience question period, where we'll have about 20 minutes, 25 minutes for people to ask questions. So if you have a question, if you open participants, you can raise your hand. I believe there should be a raise hand button. Maybe it's not under participants, but do you guys see the raise hand button at all? Yes? Justin? Okay, amazing. Because I don't think us hosts can actually raise our hands. So, so if you have a question, please raise your hand and I will do. I think that's how we'll do it. Professor Green, I think you can unmute yourself, but
Thank you so much. I want to go back to this question of the prehistory of the moment we're in and how we got here. And you've alluded to a lot of sources. You talked about the early days in the 90s and Gingrich, and perhaps by extension, the 24-hour news cycle. You've alluded to 9/11 and maybe being in a condition of war and how that potentially has led to a different atmosphere domestically. And you've alluded to how on the other side of the spectrum, how the left and the Democrats maybe 20, 30 years later would rethink some of the policies that they made in the 90s, like welfare reform, like prison reform, like the deregulation of Wall Street. But you made a kind of offhanded remark that I was hoping you might pursue, where you said some things that you said 10 years ago, you're not comfortable with. And I'm wondering, in light of this effort to try to understand how we got here, what did you have in mind there? Did they have to do with policies you supported or the tone that you were employing? Because I think it's a really important set of questions to try to diagnose this period that, as you said, I think will in fact be studied. How could a country that was so powerful seemingly in 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, sits where it sits only, 30 years later?
Yeah, so for me, it wasn't necessarily some policies, but more tone. I look back and I see some of the rhetoric, and that comes from being in that conservative bubble for a bit too long. Let's take our country back, and accusing the progressives of being Marxists and statists, and some of that kind of terminology. I look back now and I was like, oh, for God's sakes, like it was really melodramatic. And just being kind of caught up in that, it's that groupthink of the right. And I was, I look back and I'm even surprised at some of it, because I'm like, but I guess we believed it at the time because of certain things that we saw, there was really nothing to compare it to. Now, it was easy to compare that kind of rhetoric to what's happening now, and looking at how dangerous it was to create that very us versus them type of dichotomy. And I used to think it was the other side. I used to think it was the progressives that were doing that. It was us versus them, and that was true to a certain degree, but nothing like what we see now at all. And it took comes with experience also. You have to go through certain things, and as far as policy, like I'll give an example of a policy where I became a little bit more reflective on, and it was criminal justice reform. Remember, like I said, I come from a law enforcement family, so I was all about tough on crime. And but I worked on when I worked in Capitol Hill, I worked on federal law enforcement, and I was an advocate for 2 Border Patrol agents who had been unjustly imprisoned for a shooting, and they were in prison for 11 and 12 years, and it was because of mandatory minimum sentencing. And it was there was overzealous prosecutions going on there, and there was a lot of politics of how it got there. But going through that case, I saw a lot of things wrong with our federal criminal justice system. I saw a lot of things wrong with our Federal Bureau of Prisons. How things were just really not, they did not sit well with me. What prisoners had to go through to get basic things. And, these guys had advocates in Congress for them, and they could barely get deodorant and sneakers. Imagine the people who don't have that type of advocacy. There was just a lot, but like mandatory minimum sentencing, drug sentencing, the disparate way in which sentencings were applied to people of color. My eyes were open to a lot of those things that I was unaware of without having the opportunity to be involved in something directly that impacted it. And I've changed. I'm all about criminal justice reform, and that's when people ask me, was there anything that Donald Trump did that was good in this administration? And there are very few, but one of them I will give the administration credit for was the First Step Act. It's nowhere near as comprehensive as it could have been, but it is a very good first step, and that helped a lot of people. And I think that was a good way, a bipartisan way, to start rethinking how we do things in the criminal justice system. So that's just one example from a policy side. But really, for me, it was about tone. It was about tone.
Awesome. Okay, Justin, I'm going to call on you.
Yeah, so thank you again for coming. My name is Justin Greenman. I'm the president of the Penn Government and Politics Association, which oversees the Penn Political Union. So for everybody else, I'm also just going to echo, fill out the membership form. So my question is this. So I understand and generally sympathize with your concerns, about obviously purging, Trump and the Trumpian elements from the Republican Party. As somebody who is a Republican, but maybe, agrees with some of their things, disagrees with some of those things. But my fear is that there's no guarantee that defeat is going to purge the Republican Party from those elements. Like when
Right.
Gold got destroyed in 1964, you didn't have Nelson Rockefeller as the next party nominee. You had Nixon, and then you had Reagan, who were much more in his mold. When Democrats, got destroyed in 2010, the people who remained were much more liberal members of Congress, and a lot of those more conservative members who maybe would be more moderate, they never won again, and a lot of those districts are now safely in Republican hands. Possibly same way for a lot of the Republican districts like mine that were lost in 2018. Suburban districts that people voted out Republicans. The anti-Trump suburban wave. So this is maybe, I don't know if this is as much of a question or as a fear, but I like your opinion on it. What's to say, if you purge, all of these, senators, if you create like a unified Democratic control, people like Jim Jordan, people like Matt Gaetz in Florida, they're still going to be there.
Yep.
You look at like Susan Collins' seat, like that's probably never going to be won by another Republican besides her. So I guess my question is what's to say that this could almost make it even worse? That the Republican Party is going to be so hollowed out going into 2022, 2024 and beyond that there could be worse candidates than Trump, and then it'll just be even easier long-term for Democrats to really just be the dominant national party.
Listen, the Republicans were in the minority in the House for 40 years. Since Goldwater, they hadn't sniffed the majority in the House over that time. So they did pay a price there. Now you did get Nixon, you did get Reagan, but these things go in cycles. Nothing's going to happen overnight. And we've also never really seen anything like we've seen in this political climate. A lot of people who would consider themselves center right that were moderate Republicans, you're right, they've been run out of there. There's like no Northeast Republicans in the House anymore. Hardly any anyway. And that started in 2010 with the Tea Party coming in. Now, a lot of the Tea Party folks that won that year, they're not around anymore. They only lasted one or two election cycles, and then they got beaten. This is also where redistricting comes in and gerrymandering, which is a state issue, and why I wish more Americans would pay attention to who their state representatives are and what's going on in their state legislatures, because that makes a huge difference too. Every 10 years, you redraw your districts. And as long as you continue to have these gerrymandered districts on both sides, this is what happens. you know, they don't have any competition. It's like anything, you know, if you don't have any competition for what you're going to get, you're going to get, you may not get the best product. So I think a lot of it has to do with Americans paying attention to who they're electing. And I think apathy in large numbers, you know, with our low voter turnouts and things, especially in state and local elections, you don't always end up with the best folks. Like whatever the hell's happening down there in Georgia with that QAnon candidate, that's a perfect example of, you know, it used to be just the Tea Party people who they thought were way too right-wing, right? Give me a couple of the Tea Parties back instead of these QAnon crazies who believe in insane conspiracy theories. But shame on the people who are electing her. But, you know, we live in a representative democracy and you get what you vote for. So the onus is really on us as citizenry, who's acceptable and who isn't. Making sure that the extremes don't take over.
Awesome, thank you. Julian, I'm going to unmute you.
Good evening, everyone. Tara, thank you for being here. So I'm actually a Penn alumni, and I saw this in the community, and I wanted to kind of reach back and see what's going on. I'm actually the vice chair for the Millennial Commission for the City of Philadelphia. So youth engagement and fighting against apathy is one of my biggest concerns.
Yes.
So youth,
good for you.
So my question was around engaging young people. How do we convince people that, yes, it's good to be engaged during presidential elections, during like these high ticket, high profile things, but in those off-season elections, it's really important to stay involved with your local community and not just in the federal government stuff. So how do we get people to do that?
So kudos to you for doing that. It is yeoman's work and so necessary, and good for you for doing it. Thank God. It gives me hope in the next generation. So God bless you for that. My very good friend Jordan Harris is a state rep there and in Philly. I'm sure you've crossed paths with Jordan. He's like a brother to me. So you're in good hands with Jordan. And I know that Jordan is one of those who, as someone who's actually quite young and ran for office, you look at people as examples that you know, look like you or have your interest in mind and say, look, see, you know, they're involved. Not everyone's going to, you know, run at 28 or 29 years old. You know, running for office is a different commitment to public service. But what I think the best way to do it is to find the issues that affect them the most day to day and find out, well, how do you feel about this? Or how do you feel about that? And if they complain and they're not okay with it, then you say, well, if you want it to change, you need to know who's on your city council, or, you need to know who's on the state rep that's making those decisions, because state and local elections and those folks actually make decisions that impact people's daily lives more than anybody in Congress or the president. We lose sight of that. All politics is local is real. But the irony in that is that most people don't get involved. You're right. The voter participation rate in some local races is like 19% if it's an off year. I mean, it's abysmal. People fought and died for people's rights to vote in this country. You know, you go to overseas and you know, in Iraq, you have people that, fought for wars to get to the right to vote and things like that, and what's happening with them. And here we're so complacent in America, you know. But I think the key is identify what they relate to and explain to them, if you want to change it, and if you want to make a difference, this is what you have to pay attention to. My grandfather always told me, pay attention, no matter where I was going, no matter how old I got, all the way up until when he passed away at 90. Anytime I would leave him, he would always say, all right, schnookums, pay attention. So I just think that we just have to convince folks to pay attention, because if they want their lives to be better, don't bitch and complain about it, pay attention and do something. Particularly vote and be informed. Because you're quick to go to a protest, but you need to go to the ballot box. The protest is only going to go so far. So yeah, just make it relatable.
Awesome. Other questions, audience members? Again, just raise your hand and I will unmute you. So if you feel comfortable speaking, you're all free to message me your question and I can ask it.
I don't bite.
Or if our caucus chairs, if our caucus chairs have any further questions that they'd like to ask.
Yeah, I got one.
All right, cool. Go ahead.
A quick question, because I know you have to go soon, I think.
No problem.
Something that I've noticed is I'm really passionate about immigration when it comes to the US-Mexico border. And something that I've noticed with CNN and Fox News is that CNN tends to focus around women and children. And Fox News tends to focus around older men and crime. So I'm wondering how the media sensitization, or I can't even pronounce it, how that affects narratives of immigration around the country.
A lot, right? Because social repetition creates reality. You know, it's about perception, and mass media has a lot of influence in shaping people's opinions. There's a reason why Fox News continually shows videos of the caravans and all these young men that are coming over here like an invasion, and you know, making it look like, I mean, Donald Trump's whole campaign kicked off with Mexicans are rapists and they're not sending their best. Oh, there's some of them, I presume, are good people, but you know, he's setting this up and reinforcing that with propaganda. I'm sure many of you have taken propaganda classes or, you know, studied what happened in the 20th century in places like Italy and Germany and Russia. You know, that use of propaganda and repeating images over and over again and repeating things and creating those viewpoints, it works on the masses, when, especially if people are uninformed. That's why Donald Trump said he loves the poorly educated, because people don't critically think. And when you don't critically think, you start to just parrot and memorize what you're shown constantly over and over again. And you know, that applies in any kind of political sociology. That's why you come up with this messaging, and communications is its own whole you know, study area. And I just think that that's where trying to be fair and balanced, to steal a Fox phrase that doesn't apply to them, but it's that should be what it is. You know, that you can create narratives. CNN may take it too far on the other side, and they never show the balance of, you know, well, maybe there are some folks that are coming over here that are breaking the law, that, you know, there's a bad element with MS-13, and that's real, you know, but there's no balance. Same thing on, you know, with Fox. What's happening, you know, women and children and these folks that are coming over illegally and taking that dangerous journey, what happens to them, it's terrible. But we also can't have lawlessness at the border. There's nuance here. We shouldn't be caging kids and separating cruelly children from their parents. Like, that's inhumane. We don't do that here in America. Like, what are we doing? But when you start to dehumanize and otherize people, it becomes easier to mistreat them. And that is, in my opinion, not part of our founding in its ideal of becoming a more perfect union. So that's, again, where the mass media has a lot of responsibility in what they cover and how they cover it. And that's up to, you know, us as consumers of that to be critical thinkers and make decisions on what we want to consume, and not just relying on one or two sources, but being intellectually curious as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Awesome.
Immigration is such a tough issue. It's a tough issue because it's so multifaceted. It's a tough one. I worked on it for 7 years in Capitol Hill. There's some validity to the complaints that the Republicans have, and you know, but it's just been so co-opted in a really perverse way, in coarsening of that discussion. You know, we're talking about human beings here, and that tribalism is something that Trump has thrived on, and I worry about that long term.
Can I ask a question about CNN?
Haven, there's an audience member who would
Whoops,
like to...
never mind, sorry.
So Katie, I'm going to unmute you.
Thank you. And I'll get my video going here. Tara, thank you so much for being here and PPU for this great debate and event. I wanted to ask, one of the things I'm interested in with Lincoln Project and kind of linking to this question around the base and support is what kind of work Lincoln Project has done in appealing to the base. And if we think about polarization and the media as one of the divides that needs to be bridged, I'm curious to hear how Lincoln Project has sort of worked to combat that. So thank you for your thoughts on this.
Sure, it's very simple. We haven't. That's not our mission. That is not the role of the Lincoln Project in this election cycle. We're going to leave that up to other folks. Our job is to pop the bully back in the mouth and to shake people into paying attention to the hypocrisy, to the dereliction of duty, to the incompetence, and to the consequences of allowing that to continue. We don't have time to be passive. That doesn't mean that we get into the mud the way that that Trump does. It's not that. But you have to go on offense, and that's kind of been our job. We're not going after the base. The base is unmovable, unfortunately. They really are, and Trump knows that, which is why he's not trying to expand his base beyond the people that agree with him that may not have come out in 2016. They think that they could squeeze some more of those folks out. He has not tried to get the people in the middle. We are trying to get the disaffected Republicans and the 5 to 7% of people who may still be undecided, and some of those independents. That's who we're focused on. The base is unmovable in ways that we have never seen before. So it's not really our job. That's not our focus. That's not our focus. So the base all thinks that we're apostates and we should be hung and we should be strung up, which is what they tell us all the time on social media.
Yeah, I've seen it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
There's no talking to anybody like that, unfortunately.
To be fair, I do know a couple conservatives who are not part of like the Trump camp who are very appreciative of your work and your efforts in that regard.
Thank you. The operative phrase being not part of the Trump camp, which means that they still have an open mind.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, a lot of Trump folks just do not. It's I've never seen anything like it. I've called it a cult for many years and I stand by it.
Definitely. I think we have time for one more quick question before you have to go. So, okay. Justin Greenman, I will unmute you.
Yeah, good, because this is a really quick question. It's kind of a two-parter. One, is there any figure, like major figure in the Republican Party that the Lincoln Project would like hypothetically support today? And maybe two, going forward, are there figures that you think that you would support in 2024?
Yeah, so the obvious answer to that would be Mitt Romney. That's someone that we can support because at least he stood up and did the right thing when it mattered most during impeachment. Unfortunately, that list ends about there on a national level as far as current elected Republicans. Now, not taking away the governors. There was Larry Hogan, Charlie Baker in Massachusetts. There's a couple of governors who have not drank the Kool-Aid and that would be welcomed on our pirate ship. But that list is very short on a national level, unfortunately. As far as 2024, I can't speak for the Lincoln Project, but I can say for myself that someone who I would love to see come back to politics that I think has the potential to bring respectability and gravitas back to the Republican Party would be Paul Ryan. I love Paul Ryan, and I was very upset when I saw what the position Paul Ryan was put in when he was speaker, having to deal with Trump. I know Paul Ryan was horrified and thought that they could possibly control him. They were naive in thinking that. I'm from New Jersey. I grew up with Donald Trump. Like, you know, I understand how people like that work. And, you know, God bless Paul Ryan being from Wisconsin, but they're really nice in the Midwest. The Midwest folks are too nice. And they were just really completely unprepared for how vicious and dishonest Donald Trump really was, which is why he walked away. You know, and I think that Paul Ryan is one of the few people who has a national ID that still has enough credibility that he could return to politics and potentially be a person who bridges the gap. But maybe 2024 might be too soon. It depends on a lot of things have to happen between now and then, with, you know, being able to purge the party of these folks. We'll see. You know, it is a cancer. I mean, it's funny. It was the governor of Texas, former governor of Texas, Rick Perry, who called Trump a cancer on conservatism, and he was right. So we'll see if we can get it into remission or if it's going to come back. Hopefully, it's gone for good after this election. We work on that. So, but I'm rooting for Paul Ryan, not Nikki Haley. She sold out. You know, we still had hopes for her. She's the worst, and I'm so disappointed in her decision to become a sycophant. And, you know, some of those others, you know, this idea that the Trumps are going to continue on, you know, Donald Trump Jr. thinks he's going to run for president or something like that. I don't put it past them to continue this on, because you're going to still have, Fox News is still going to be around, OANN and Newsmax and the breeding ground for this nonsense. They're still going to be around, trying to convince these folks that they have a shot at these things. But just like I said, the coalition of the decent has to be bigger and more powerful and more vocal, and to beat that back. It's literally like we're the Rebel Alliance, the collective we against the imperialists, the imperial, you know, Death Star here.
Great. So with that, I think
cultural reference that I hope you guys get.
Don't worry, we do.
Thank God for the new Star Wars movies.
All right, I think with that, we're going to start wrapping up. So Professor Green, I don't know if you have any closing remarks or anything, but I just want to say thank you to everyone, and to you, Tara, specifically for coming out. This was an amazing event. I feel like I've learned a lot, and it was very interesting hearing everyone's perspectives. And I definitely, we live in interesting times, and we'll definitely see how this goes in 2 months' time, less than 2 months' time, I guess.
48 days, 47 days.
God,
nobody's
scary.
Counting.
Definitely scary, nerve-wracking. I hope it's, we'll see how it goes. But anyway, I want to say thank you so much to our caucus chairs as well, and thank you to the Mitchell Center and Professor Green and Professor Roth for all the work that they have put in. If you haven't filled out our interest form, and you're an audience member, please fill out our interest form so we can contact you about our future events. And yeah, I think that's it.
Right. Well, thank you guys. Thank you so much. It has been an absolute pleasure. I'm glad that we were able to have these conversations. Sometimes it's, you don't always get to have them long form this way. So I'm so appreciative of the chance to chat with you guys and have smart conversations with you all. And I always say that if you listen to my podcast, I always begin it with, in a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. And I feel like we're all part of that revolution to make sure that truth and facts and decency and civility and constitutional norms are restored in this country. So thank you guys so much for what you're doing. And I appreciate you guys bringing me along. If you ever need me, you know where to find me.
Thank you.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.